Hello, everybody. I am primarily a professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, where I research brain health across the lifespan in the lab, as well as with patients and individuals in various settings, from elite and professional sports through to people with traumatic brain injury and long-term cognitive decline. These are my disclosures. Like I said, mainly do government-funded work in the lab. I do have some affiliations with digital health companies, as well as a couple of charities, primarily Food for the Brain and the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, where I'm a trustee and treasurer. What we're going to talk about today, and what you've been hearing about today, really relates to this excellent quote that comes from Gil Livingston's Lancet Commission report that was published in 2020. You may have seen this already today, where they said that it's never too early and never too late in the life course or for dementia prevention. And this idea is actually starting to permeate even into traditional academic and medical thinking. So this is a position statement from the American Academy of Neurology that came out a few months ago. And in there, they say the era of preventative neurology has arrived. Finally, starting to acknowledge that we can prevent neurodegenerative disorders and, hopefully boost everybody's brain health throughout their lifespan if we take the right kind of approach. So what proportion might be preventable and what parts might go into this? This diagram on the left-hand side, this is from the Livingston report, where they count up all these different aspects of lifestyle and the environment that they think contribute to dementia and may be preventable. They said 40% as you can see, all those numbers on the left-hand side: education, hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, later in life, air pollution, diabetes. And this is probably a conservative estimate because they don't include everything that we might consider to be important that we know is related to dementia risk. So they didn't include sleep. They didn't include diet quality and nutrient status, which you've already heard about a lot today, and I'll also talk about a little bit more as well. And they don't talk about late life cognitive activity, which I will also talk about. And more recent estimates using UK Biobank data say that maybe it's even up to 70+% of dementia that is preventable if we address all the right risk factors. So this is one of my favorite figures from Professor Yin-Tai Yu, looking at all these different risk factors for dementia and cognitive decline across the lifespan. You can see age along the x-axis, and then the relative risk, or the risk of dementia, on the y-axis. So anything that's above the dotted line is associated with increased risk. Anything below the dotted line is associated with decreased risk. And you'll start to see many of the things that you've been talking about today, many of the things that are in the 8 spokes of the cog. But protective factors include diet, physical activity, cognitive activity. Then factors that we might want to otherwise address include excess alcohol, high blood pressure, homocysteine is on here, stress, sleep disturbance. All of these things are important as we think about how to protect the brain long term. The problem then becomes that this is quite an extensive list of factors, and I sort of went to social media and I found this list, the summary of Alzheimer's prevention, things that we need to do in order to prevent Alzheimer's disease or significant cognitive decline. Here we have 10 or 15 things, and this is all absolutely very evidence-based. It maps quite nicely onto this recent review paper that was published in one of the Lancet journals. Again, here you see all these different relative risks for dementia and those various factors that we might want to think about. However, it doesn't necessarily stop there. Depending on who you're talking to, you may hear 30, 40, 50 different things that we need to address in order to prevent dementia. And it really becomes almost quite unwieldy in terms of how we might start to think about addressing that. So the issue that I've seen, or I've had when trying to get through all of this research, is that, yes, prevailing opinion really across the board is starting to suggest that most dementia can be preventable, and there are a large number of risk factors, but it's really unclear how we implement those on an individual level. How do we actually start to address that in practice? The relationships of all these risk factors are assumed to be linear, which we know that they're not, and I'll give you some examples of that later. There's also no hierarchy of how these things fit together, and no framework to sort of really understand this and then figure out how might you apply that framework to an individual, and then that helps you act upon all those different risk factors. So I'm going to give my model for thinking about the brain and some of the work that we've been doing, Food for the Brain, and writing papers and approaches, including several of the people that you've heard from today. But essentially, it tries to explain these multiple interacting risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia, and I'm going to put them into three main buckets. So the first bucket I call supply. This is making sure we have a healthy vascular system, getting oxygen and nutrients to the brain and having the right nutrients there. Then I'm going to talk about stimulus or demand, so how we actually use our brain and bodies, and that directs the resources to the appropriate parts of the brain so that they work better. And then recovery. This is when we actually adapt to cognitive demand. And at the same point, we want to avoid things that inhibit that process, like stress and some toxic exposures like smoking and air pollution. So I'll go through each of these buckets in turn, and we'll start with supply. So you may have heard the adage that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And in many respects, this is absolutely true. And this is because we normally think about neurons in the brain. Neurons maybe make up about half the cells in the brain. The other half are glia. And then all of those cells are actually impregnated into this incredibly dense vascular network that supplies all the necessary oxygen and nutrients. And this is directed by demand. So when one area of your brain becomes more active, it stimulates blood vessels in that area, and they actually expand to deliver more blood to that area of the brain, more oxygen, more nutrients. And in order for this to happen, we need the vascular system, those blood vessels, to be healthy. So there's a lot of overlap between the risk factors for cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, and they also overlap. And that's because this blood supply is so critical. So this is an example of that in action. So these are data from the Memory and Aging Project. More than 1,500 adults in their 70s and 80s, and they looked at cardiovascular risk using a framing and risk score. So age, cholesterol, diabetes, blood pressure, smoking. And what they saw was that they stratified people by their level of cardiovascular risk. And you can see across a range of different cognitive functions. Here we have global cognition. Here we have episodic memory, working memory, perceptual speed or processing speed. And essentially, the higher your cardiovascular risk, the faster your decline in cognitive function over this follow-up period of 20 years. We also know, related to this, that metabolic disease and blood sugar control is really important for long-term cognitive function. So these are data from the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, and they categorized people by their HbA1c. So normal HbA1c, that's less than 40 millimoles per mole, or 5.7% if you're working in American units. And then they had individuals who had prediabetes and those with type 2 diabetes. And what they saw was that after adjusting for a whole host of potential confounders and other health metrics, the higher your HbA1c, or the worse your blood sugar control, the faster the decline in global cognitive function, again, now over 10 years. So this is really important because we know that blood sugar control is a key contributor to the health of our blood vessels, as well as getting glucose into the brain as an energy source. Related to this, one of my favorite ways of assessing the brain is using this algorithm called brain age, where they do an MRI scan. And after training this machine learning algorithm, they say to the algorithm, how old does this brain scan look? It's kind of like a biological age for your brain. And in this study, using the brain age algorithm, this was within individuals who already had diabetes. So we know that their blood sugar control isn't great. But even within that group, when they looked at how high their fasting blood sugar was, those who had the highest blood sugar compared to those who had the lowest blood sugar had a big difference in how old their brain looks. So even within people who already have issues with blood sugar, the higher, the older your brain looks. And actually blood sugar within this population was one of the biggest predictors of how old somebody's brain looked, regardless of how old they were chronologically. The next aspect of supply that we already talked about and that you've heard a lot about today is nutrient status, and there are a few that are critically important. So just to go over them very quickly, we know that not having adequate vitamin D is a risk factor for dementia. So if your vitamin D is less than 20 nanograms per mil or 50 nanomoles per liter, you have about a 30% increased risk of dementia. So this is something that can be tested and supplemented if necessary. Similarly, we know that anemia or low iron is a risk factor. Iron is really critical, particularly for the white matter of the brain, which is responsible for these fast connections. And those who are anemic, so less than 120 grams per liter in women and less than 130 grams per liter in men, is associated with about a 40% increased risk of cognitive decline. At the other end, I don't have a picture here, but we know that high hemoglobin is also associated with an increased risk of dementia, and that's probably because the commonest cause of high hemoglobin is obstructive sleep apnea. So if you're looking at your numbers and you're now above sort of like 16, 17, 18, then that's a good reason to be checked for obstructive sleep apnea, which we know is another risk factor for dementia. I mentioned earlier that these risk factors interact, and this is a prime example of that. So these are data from the Vascular study. Again, you may have seen these already today, where they were supplementing with B vitamins in order to lower homocysteine, and they looked at how that interacted with omega-3 status. And what they found was that in order to slow brain atrophy and cognitive decline, you had to have adequate omega-3 status in order for the homocysteine lowering to work. So there's an interaction here. You can't just improve one or the other. You have to make sure that you have both. And actually, this has been replicated in several other randomized controlled trials, in particular the Omega AD trial and the B-Proof trial, showing that if you supplement with just B vitamins or omega-3s, you don't get the same benefit as if you have both. So this is where I said that these factors are not linear. We can't look at them individually. We have to look at how they connect to one another. The next part of supply is going to be, well, how can we improve some of our vascular health? How can we improve blood supply to the brain? And one of the best ways to do that, if not the best way to do it, is physical activity. This is a nice graph from recent meta-analysis where they looked at the minimum effective dose of physical activity that is required to improve cognitive function in a meaningful way. We can get statistically significant results, but it needs to be high enough that actually it's making a difference. And so this red line here we have the dose of exercise on the x-axis and the change in cognitive function on the y-axis. And this is where they said, this red line, this is the minimum effective dose. If we convert that from sort of a scientific METs per minute per week into actual levels of physical activity, it's something like 60 minutes of gardening a day, 20 minutes of Pilates a day, 20 minutes of dancing a day, 5 minutes of sprinting a day. The idea essentially being that you can mix and match in order to get some of these benefits here, and it's just a factor of intensity times time. So if your activity is slightly less vigorous, then you need to do it for a little bit longer. If it's very vigorous, then you can do it for a shorter period of time. Although different types of exercise will also affect the brain differently, as we'll go into now. One of the first studies where we saw in humans that you could increase the size of the hippocampus, which is really critical for memory, used a brisk walking intervention. So we know that brisk walking is enough to improve the structure of the brain. They did this 40 minutes 3 times a week for a year. We also know that you can start this late in life. So there was a Scandinavian study showing that those who improved their physical fitness in their 50s and 60s saw significant decreases in their risk of dementia, even if they had low levels of fitness earlier in life. When we think about exercise, we often think about aerobic exercise and running, but strength training and muscle mass are also really critical. We know that muscle mass and muscle function both correlate with cognitive function. And that's because the process of building muscles directly stimulates the brain, but also our muscles are some of our most important tools in order to do things like improve vascular or improve blood sugar control, but also release factors that support the brain, like brain-derived neurotrophic factor when we exercise them. We just submitted actually a review paper looking at the effect of resistance training or weightlifting on the brain. And what it looks like is that the optimal dose is training 2 to 3 times a week for at least 6 months, but it only needs to be sort of 30 minutes or so at a time. 5 or 6 exercises, 3 sets of sort of 8 to 12 repetitions, something like that, a very, very basic resistance training program. And that particularly protects the white matter in the brain, which is at risk as people get older. This is an example of some of the work that we've done. So this is a paper that we published last year where we took data from individuals primarily in their 60s from the US NHANES cohort. And you can already see from this figure, this is how I like to think about factors interacting, because I built this sort of statistical network to look at how all these risk factors interact. So we're looking at something called the digit symbol substitution test. You can see it on the right-hand side here. This is a measure largely of processing speed, which does tend to decline with age. What you have to do is fill in these numbered boxes with the associated symbol, and you need to fill in 133 of these in 2 minutes. So you have to work really quite quickly. And then we looked at all these different risk factors associated with cognitive decline and how they then connected to processing speed. And we can see several things here around the network. So if there's a link, if there's a line between something, that tells you that they're significantly associated with one another. The color tells you the direction. So if it's sort of red or orange, that's positive, one goes up, the other goes up. If it's blue or green, that's negative, one goes up, the other goes down. So here, for example, HbA1c, as HbA1c goes up, processing speed goes down. Here we have anemia. I mentioned iron earlier. So if you're anemic, then processing speed goes down. One of the most important things we saw was education, and we know that education is really important for cognitive function. So that was our strongest positive predictor. The more education somebody had, the faster their processing speed. But what we were really interested in here is how do your muscles predict your cognitive function? And what we found was your strength relative to your body size was the most important thing. So it's not how big are your muscles overall. You don't want as big as muscles as possible. You want them to be strong and functional. And that's a strength that you could develop with things like body weight exercises, squats and push-ups and pull-ups and things like that. What's interesting is that when we look at all the different types of exercise and how they affect the brain, the best one in terms of the benefits that we get seems to be coordinative exercise. So we've talked about aerobic exercise, walking, we've talked about strength training, resistance training, but coordinative exercise seems to be particularly good at stimulating the brain. So this was a meta-analysis that looked at that, and they found that of all the different types of exercise, coordinative exercise was the one associated with most improvement in cognitive function. And when you look at the individual studies, they tend to compare what we call open skill sports, which is something that requires you to react to the environment, that has some kind of balance component, to unimodal training like cycling or jogging. So we might think about badminton, table tennis, gymnastics, dancing. These kinds of movements seem to be particularly good at stimulating the brain. One, because they probably activate more total muscles while you're moving them, and then actually the process of having to coordinate your body in space seems to be an additional stimulus for the brain. So that extra challenge seems to be particularly beneficial. This brings me on to the next bucket of things that we might think about, which is stimulus or demand, how we use our brains, and why that's really important. I've spent a few years working with a very good friend of mine who's a neurologist, Dr. Josh Turknett, and we published a couple of years ago a paper talking about how the function of the brain really seems to be driven by demand using this process that we call demand function coupling. And actually, it's very similar to how our muscles respond to exercise. So if you want think about getting fitter or stronger, we know that the most important thing to do is some kind of exercise. And then we can improve responses to that exercise with diet and sleep and these other factors. But really the most important thing is the exercise. And the brain seems to be exactly the same. So we can increase cognitive demand or cognitive stimulus a number of ways. I already mentioned education. There's music, language, social interaction. We can do brain training. We can learn new skills. And then what this does is this upregulates a whole host of important processes in the cells in the brain, like neurons, but also the other glia that I mentioned earlier. Things around autophagy, repair, neurogenesis, all these things we want to generate new connections in the brain. And then we need a period of recovery in order for that adaptation to occur. So that's where things like sleep become critically important. On the other side, we know that if we remove some of these stimuli, then cognitive decline can accelerate. So that happens around retirement, when we're socially isolated, or if we're sedentary. And I'll give you some examples of that as well. A lot of this, my own interest in this starts right at the beginning of life, because my research, at least partly, focuses on brain development in babies who have brain injury. So this study really shows that very nicely, like how regardless of your starting point with your brain and your risk of cognitive impairment, the environment and how we use our brains really has this amazing effect in terms of driving cognitive function. So in this study, what they did is they looked at babies who had some kind of brain injury in the hospital. They were born preterm, which is, so they were born earlier than they should have been. And this is one of the strongest risk factors for cognitive impairment. And then they stratified the kids based on maternal education. And this is a proxy for a whole host of socioeconomic factors, as well as, the infant's own education, but food security and all these things that we know are critically important. But what they found was that if a baby had a brain injury, but then went home to an environment where the mother had a postgraduate degree, that brain injury had no effect on the infant's later cognitive function. So here you can see at 18, 36 and 36 months and 4.5 years, those with the dotted line, those are the ones with injury, and the solid line are those without injury. And you see they're essentially exactly the same if a mother had a postgraduate degree. But based on maternal education, that injury could have more and more of an effect. So it's this interaction again between the brain itself and the environment that it's going home to. So really just saying that there's this really, really important effect of the environment and how we use our brains and where we put those brains as they develop. This was something that we also saw in our own research. I have been doing a lot of work as a statistician for a large clinical trial here at the University of Washington. Again, these are preterm babies who have a high risk of cognitive impairment. Again, you can see my fancy network graph. In the middle, we have cognition, this at 2 years of age, so 2 years after they left the hospital. And of all the factors, and I have huge amounts of data in terms of the drugs these kids were exposed to, the injuries these kids had, like all these other things, the most important predictor of cognitive function at 2 years was, again, maternal education, which is just telling you about the environment that these babies are going home to has this really dominant effect on cognitive function. And here you can kind of see that in the network, and then this has them all ranked. And so you can see maternal education is risk factor number 1. So as we expand this beyond just babies, we know that early life education has this dominant effect on our long-term cognitive function. This is data, sort of a summary figure from a meta-analysis that came out a few years ago. And what you can see is that in general, if you have cognitive performance on the y-axis and age on the x-axis, and then you have sort of a theoretical functional deficit line. So you want to avoid going below this line because that might be associated with a diagnosis of something like dementia. And you can see that in general, across several studies, those who have higher education, they end up with a line that is higher on the y-axis. It doesn't necessarily change the rate of decline because you need to do other things later in life in order to change the rate of decline. But if you start from a higher point, then you will reach the line of dementia much later. So already early in life, you can shift your curve of dementia risk by stimulating the brain through the process of formal education. Then we know that if you continue to stimulate the brain later in life, you can slow that rate of decline. So these are data from the Midlife in the US study, where they looked at executive function over a period of 9 years, and they categorized people by whether they increased their levels of cognitive engagement or if they stayed the same or decreased. And you can see those who increased their cognitive activities, and this was fairly basic things like reading, word games, puzzles, going to lectures or courses, or doing some writing. Those who are engaged in those kinds of cognitively stimulating activities or increased that have a slower rate of decline of executive function compared to those who did not. So what comes out of this, which was shown very nicely by an extensive paper looking at adult cognitive enhancement by Christopher Herzog et al., published now 15 years ago, was that we each have this very broad range of possible cognitive function that then gets expressed in different ways based on the things that we do. So here again, they have cognitive function on the y-axis, they have age on the x-axis, and essentially each of us has our own potential band of cognitive function. And two of the three main things they talked about in terms of how you would increase your cognitive function and stay towards the upper part of your own personal band was stimulating your brain with learning and skill development activities, and then expressing those new skills through social interaction. So that was like 2/3 of what they thought was most important for driving improvements in cognitive function over the lifespan, is how we stimulate and then use our brains. This then is supported by all the other factors that we've been hearing about today. So this is a nice summary paper, again, published in one of the Lancet journals. And they looked at some of the risk factors we've already talked about today, you've heard about today. They have blood pressure, insomnia, inactivity, glycemic control. We talked about smoking. And how they framed it was that if you address these risk factors, what you can do is you can push forward into the future any potential decline in cognitive function. So if you can think about all the things I've just mentioned, early life cognitive stimulation increases our maximum cognitive function. If we then address all these different factors, we can push forward the period at which we might experience decline. And then if we continue to stimulate our brains late in life, we can slow that decline. And if we do all of those things, we will hopefully avoid any diagnosis of dementia at any point in our lifetimes. So just to kind of give a couple more examples of that, I wanted to really show how the brain responds to cognitive stimulus as this primary driver of cognitive function. So we know that the adaptations of the brain to cognitive demand are highly specific. So you get really good at the things that you practice, but we also know that things that have a broad range of stimulus have some carryover. So if we're challenging lots of parts of the brain, we keep or increase cognitive functions across multiple different paradigms. And then we also know that if we remove a cognitive stimulus, that accelerates cognitive decline. So this is one of my favorite examples. This is of new taxi drivers in London back when black cabs were a thing. And in order to become a black cab driver, you had to learn the knowledge, which is essentially memorizing this map. And so it's 25,000 streets in a 6-mile radius around Charing Cross Station in central London. And they looked at 3 groups of people, those who studied for the test and passed it, those who studied for the test and failed it, and then a control group. And the studying for the test takes like 2 to 3 years. So this is 2 to 3 years of intense work memorizing this map. And what they saw was that those who took the test and passed it had this significant increase in signal on an MRI scan in certain areas of the brain associated with memorization. So they had really trained their brains to be exceptionally good at memorizing this kind of map. However, what's interesting is that as they got really good at this, they got less good at something else. So another part of the test they did was they had people memorize this Taylor complex figure, and then they had to remember as much of it as they could 30 minutes later. And those who successfully memorized the map of London got less good at memorizing these abstract figures because they were so good at memorizing, this very complex but rigid and regimented thing, which is this map. They got less good at memorizing abstract things. So we can specifically direct resources in our brain to get good at the thing we want to get good at, but there are trade-offs. Just like if you want to be a very good marathon runner, you probably wouldn't spend all day in the gym lifting weights. You probably have to spend a lot of time running. It's exactly the same. There are trade-offs. We also know that as we stimulate the brain, with a specific skill, we see changes in that exact area of the brain associated with that skill. So this is a nice study now published 20 years ago looking at people who learned how to juggle, three-ball cascade. And what they saw was that there was a significant increase in this signal, particularly here in the occipital lobe. And that the occipital lobe is associated with vision. So actually juggling is more of a visual skill than it is a motor skill. And then, so after 6 months of learning how to juggle, they had this significant change in the brain, and then they stopped juggling, and then you start to see that change regress because they're no longer stimulating that activity. So again, just saying that if you want to stimulate a certain part of the brain with a certain skill, you need to keep doing it. We can have more broad carryover. So maybe juggling isn't the skill that you want to spend all your time investing in, but this is a nice example of sort of these broad multimodal ways that we can stimulate the brain even later in life. So this is still a pilot study. They didn't have a control group, but they took 36 adults in their 60s and 70s, and they trained them in a range of different skills. So they had learning Spanish, photography, learning how to use an iPad, drawing, they had music composition. So these very sort of human, broad skills. And as they did that, they saw this steady increase in cognitive function. And that actually continued for up to a year after they stopped the intervention. So we can continue to improve cognitive function even later in life by really challenging ourselves with new skills. And then, as I've already mentioned, we want to keep using the skills that we develop if we want to keep, being good at those things. So this is an example of that. This is a study where they took older and younger amateur and expert pianists, and they studied them in two different ways. One was they looked at their processing speed in general, their sort of like broad cognitive function. They actually used the digit symbol substitution test that I mentioned earlier. And they saw that, as expected, those who were older had a slightly slower processing speed than those who were younger. But when they looked at piano-related skills, they found that those who were expert pianists and older had just as good skills as those who were younger. And the most important predictor of how good their piano skills were was how much they practice. So age is really not this driver of complex skill or function. It's just how much are you using that skill? How much are you continuing to challenge your brain? And like I mentioned earlier, if we then remove these stimuli, if we stop using and challenging our brains, our function declines or accelerates, or cognitive decline accelerates. So we know that retirement is the point at which the risk of this is greatest. There was actually a very nice paper that came out recently showing that cognitively demanding jobs were associated with lower dementia risk, but we know that those who retire, particularly if they retire early, have a faster risk of cognitive decline. So we need to keep stimulating ourselves. And this is an example of that from Sweden, showing that those who retire early have a higher risk of dementia. Related to this, and coming into our last sort of leg of my stool, is social connection. So yes, work itself is cognitively stimulating, but it's also where we develop a lot of our social connection and social relationships. And that may be why when we retire, we lose some of that, and that accelerates cognitive decline. So these are forest plots from a meta-analysis looking at social engagement and a risk of dementia. On the left-hand side, you can see that those who have good social engagement have a decreased risk of dementia. And on the other side, those who have poor social engagement have an increased risk. And this is whether you have a good social network, you feel supported, or whether you're living alone or have poor social support. So we know that social connection is really critically important. Which, like I said, brings us to our last part of supporting the brain as we challenge it and try and improve its function. And what's interesting is that when you look at the areas of the brain that are affected by social isolation that you have here on the left-hand side, and sort of in the middle here in green, you can see the hippocampus, really important for memory. You also have aspects of the prefrontal cortex and the temporal lobe here in blue. These areas of the brain that shrink or atrophy in the face of social isolation are very, very similar to the areas of the brain that are affected in Alzheimer's disease that you can see on the right-hand side here. So there's this direct connection between how we're socially using our brains and our risk of cognitive decline. And we know that our social environment drives our physiology. This is a very nice paper that was published by George Slavich and colleagues a couple of years ago. And what they show is that when we are socially isolated or socially stressed, we don't feel socially supported. It switches on this evolutionary derived sort of adaptation in our physiology that's associated with increased stress responses and increased chronic inflammation. And so as we feel stressed because we're socially isolated, this then drives this pattern of physiology that's associated with chronic disease, including increased risks of dementia. The final parts that we said we talk about are the key pieces of helping the brain to recover and adapt. Sleep being critically important to that. That's when we have plasticity and adaptation. Like I said, is when we clear metabolic waste from the brain. We know that both sleep timing and quality predict cognitive function. So a regular and adequate bedtime and sleep period is really important for long-term cognitive function. And both poor sleep quality and quantity are important and drive dementia risk. And this is long-term, but you might also think about your day-to-day. We know that if you're acutely sleep deprived, it makes you less empathetic. It makes you less able to make good lifestyle decisions. If you're trying to make changes to your diet or other aspects of your lifestyle, we know that that's much harder when you're sleep deprived. So sleep really underpins so much of this. I mentioned briefly that stress impedes function, and we know that that's important from a number of meta-analyses. And you can see on the left-hand side here, this is the effect of stressful life events on dementia risk. So those who had these several stressful life events had an increased risk of dementia. And this is also relevant to those who have chronic subjective stress. So it doesn't really matter where the stress comes from. It's how we feel about it that's most important. So we can't objectify somebody's stress. What really matters is how that is affecting them and their physiology. So this is where stress reduction techniques become important. We know, particularly as we get older, you can see on the left-hand side here that those who meditate regularly, they have a less or a slower decline in the size of different parts of the brain, the slower atrophy compared to people who don't meditate. And again, particularly important as individuals got older. But we also know that those who meditate are different from those who don't. And if we do in a randomized controlled trial where people were randomized to sort of an 8-week course of meditation and yoga, they saw the same thing, a significant improvement in the hippocampus on an MRI scan. So we know we can intervene and address stress. The very final thing, before I get kicked off here, we mentioned smoking and alcohol. On the left-hand side, you can see this meta-analysis of smoking and risk of dementia. And it's essentially linear. The more you smoke, the higher your risk. And with alcohol, something similar. Once you get above sort of 2 units a day, you start to see decreases in the size of certain parts of the brain associated with dementia. So this kind of all comes together in this model that I talked about: demand, supply, and support. And like I said already, that when we increase cognitive demand, we increase supply. We need a healthy blood a blood supply in order to do that. We need nutrients in order to do that. We need then supporting processes like sleep, and these all interact and then result in this improvement in brain structure, function, and overall health. And a good example of this is the finger trial. It was published a few years ago, where they took individuals at high risk of cognitive decline and they changed their diet. They gave them an exercise program. They gave them a cognitive training, sort of cognitive demand program, and they did vascular risk monitoring. And then they looked at their cognitive function. Here we have processing speed and executive function. And those who were in the intervention group had significant improvements over a control group that didn't have the intervention. I was going to very briefly mention a couple of interactions before I give you my model. Hopefully, Patrick will give me one more minute. So I mentioned pollution, air pollution, we know is a risk factor for dementia because it negatively impacts how the brain responds to demand and functions, but it interacts with B vitamin status. So these are data from a study here at the University of Washington, where they showed that if you were exposed to a high amount of pollution, but you had good B vitamin status, that pollution did not negatively affect your brain. So that, again, this interaction between factors. This is another one showing that in order to have healthy neurotransmitters, we need both vitamin D and omega-3s in order to get all the right things in place in the brain. But then in order to get the amino acids into the brain, we can stimulate that with exercise. So again, an interaction between exercise and nutrient status. And then very finally, I'll skip that slide, but what I wanted to show you was we've talked about, when you've heard about glucose uptake into the brain is probably decreased in dementia. But actually, the brain, even in early dementia, still responds to cognitive demand by increasing glucose uptake. So part of the reason why we see low glucose uptake in the brain with dementia is because we're not using the brain, rather than because it cannot take up those nutrients. So this is our final slide. This is a model that we're working on, several of us, to try and build together the ways that these different risk factors interact. So again, this is not just one thing where you can have a list and address the whole list. We need to think about how multiple factors come together, and so you can kind of see how all these modifiable risk factors around the outside then affect these different processes we can measure around hormones and metabolic health. And then about half of these at least are driven by stimulus, how we're actually using our brains. So that's it. I just wanted to quickly summarize, like we said, that the majority of dementia seems to be preventable, but a systems-based approach is essential. And remember that your brain has some control over its own destiny. It doesn't just sit there and then get exposed to the thing that you eat and negatively affected by that. My too long didn't read is if you're going to do anything to support your brain health today, go learn a new skill, preferably with a friend, and then maybe followed by some surf and turf to get your B vitamins and omega-3s and support those new processes in the brain. Thanks very much.